I have worked a lot of strange jobs in my life, but for about 3 years in my late 20s, I was a mobile emergency locksmith. It's one of those jobs where you become an invisible part of the scenery in other people's worst moments. You see a lot of weird things when you're the guy they call at 2 in the morning because they're locked out of their house, or their car, or because they just kicked out an abusive partner and need the deadbolts changed before the sun comes up. You get used to seeing people in a state of panic, anger, or extreme intoxication. You develop a thick skin and a sixth sense for when a situation is going to go south. But nothing I experienced in those first 2.5 years could have prepared me for a call I took on a damp Wednesday night in late October. It's the reason I don't do that kind of work anymore. And it's the reason I still check the locks on my own doors 3 or 4 times before I can even close my eyes to sleep. It was a slow night, and the rain was coming down in that fine misting drizzle that coats the roads in a slick sheen and makes the streetlights look like blurred halos. My phone rang around 1:15 in the morning. Dispatch gave me an address out in an affluent, heavily wooded suburb on the extreme edge of the county line. The client had requested an emergency installation of high-security deadbolts on a couple of interior doors. It was a little unusual to want interior locks done in the middle of the night, but not entirely unheard of. Sometimes people have a break-in and suddenly realize they want their master bedroom reinforced, or maybe they have a messy roommate situation escalating. The dispatcher said the guy on the phone sounded calm, polite, and was willing to pay the exorbitant after-hours emergency fee in cash. That was all I needed to hear. I grabbed my thermos of coffee, hopped into my work van, and started the 40-minute drive out to the sticks. The property was isolated. Truly off the grid for a suburb. I turned off the main 2-lane highway onto a private, unlit gravel road that wound through a dense canopy of old-growth pine trees for almost a mile. The trees were so thick, they practically blocked out the sky, and my headlights barely cut through the fog rolling off the wet needles. Finally, the trees broke, and I pulled up to a massive, beautiful mid-century modern house. It had a lot of glass, natural stone, and sharp angles. Every light in the house was blazing, cutting through the dark like a beacon. I parked in the circular driveway, grabbed my heavy tool bag, and jogged up to the deep, covered porch to get out of the rain. Before I could even raise my knuckle to knock, the heavy wooden front door swung open. The man standing there did not fit the vibe of a panicked homeowner. He looked to be in his late 40s, impeccably groomed, with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair. He was wearing a thick, expensive-looking cream-colored cardigan over a crisp button-down shirt and tailored slacks. He looked like he had stepped out of a catalog for luxury winter wear. He greeted me with a warm, easy smile and a firm handshake, introducing himself as David. His voice was smooth, almost soothing, and he apologized profusely for dragging me out in such terrible weather. He ushered me inside, insisting I leave my wet boots on the mat and offering me a fresh cup of coffee or a towel to dry off. I politely declined the coffee, just wanting to get the job done and get back to my warm apartment. The inside of the house was spotless. It smelled faintly of bleach, lemon polish, and expensive cinnamon candles. It was almost too clean, like a model home where no one actually lived, devoid of any clutter, mail, or personal photographs. David walked me down a long, wide hallway with polished hardwood floors, chatting amiably the whole time. He told me he was an architectural consultant and had just bought the place a few months ago. He had a very disarming way of speaking, making strong eye contact, nodding at my brief replies, and projecting this aura of total harmlessness. He led me to a heavy, solid oak door at the end of the hall. He explained that this door led down to the basement. His elderly mother, he told me, with a sigh of deep, practiced sadness, had recently moved in with him. He said she suffered from severe advanced dementia and had a terrifying habit of wandering at night. A few days ago, she had apparently opened the basement door and nearly fallen down the steep concrete steps. He said it broke his heart, but for her own safety, he needed a double-cylinder deadbolt installed on the door immediately, and another one on the door of the guest room she was staying in. Now, in my line of work, a double-cylinder deadbolt is a specific request. It means there is no thumb-turn latch on the inside. It requires a physical key to lock and unlock it from both sides. Fire codes usually prohibit them on exterior doors because they can trap people inside during an emergency. On an interior door, it was a major red flag. I hesitated for a second and mentioned the safety hazard, but David just offered that same warm, slightly pained smile. He said he understood completely, but the fire risk was secondary to the immediate danger of her falling down a flight of concrete stairs. He promised he would keep the key on a hook high up on the wall where only he could reach it. His demeanor was incredibly caring, and frankly, it wasn't my job to enforce residential building codes. I was just the guy with the drill. So, I set my bag down and got to work. I started with the basement door. Drilling a fresh hole for a deadbolt into solid, old-growth oak is loud, messy work. You have to use a heavy-duty hole saw, and the friction kicks up a lot of smoke and the smell of burning wood. David stood a few feet away, leaning against the hallway wall, watching me with mild interest. He kept up a steady stream of casual conversation, asking about my job, the craziest calls I'd been on, how long I'd lived in the area. At first, it was fine, just typical small talk to fill the silence. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel an uncomfortable prickle on the back of my neck. Even over the deafening whine of my power drill, I could feel his eyes locked onto me. Whenever I paused to check the alignment or clear the sawdust, I would glance over, and he was staring with this intense, unblinking focus. The warm smile was still painted on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. His eyes were cold, assessing, and completely dead. It was the look a predator gives a piece of meat, calculating the effort it takes to consume it. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just tired, spooked by the dark woods and letting my imagination run wild. I finished drilling the primary hole through the door face and moved on to chiseling out the recess for the strike plate on the doorframe. To get a good angle, I had to open the basement door and stand on the threshold. As soon as I cracked the heavy oak door open, a wave of freezing air washed over my face, carrying a smell that made my stomach instantly drop. It wasn't the smell of a dusty, unused basement. It was a thick, metallic stench of unwashed bodies, raw sewage, and dried blood. It was the unmistakable, horrifying smell of human suffering. It was so potent, it practically punched me in the throat, and I had to force myself not to gag. I kept my head down, staring intently at the doorframe, pretending I was just focused on lining up my chisel. As I tapped my chisel into the wood with my hammer, my eyes flicked to the inside of the heavy basement door. The exterior facing the hallway was perfectly polished and pristine, but the interior side, the side facing the dark, descending stairwell, was destroyed. The thick oak was covered in hundreds of deep, frantic gouges. The wood was splintered and stained with dark, rusty smears. They weren't tool marks. They were scratch marks. They started about waist high and went all the way down to the floor, overlapping in a chaotic, desperate frenzy. Somebody had been clawing at that door with their bare hands, trying to dig their way through 2 inches of solid wood. My breath hitched in my chest, and the story about the elderly mother with dementia evaporated instantly. You don't put a double-cylinder deadbolt on a door to keep a confused old woman from falling downstairs. You put it on to ensure whatever is trapped at the bottom of those stairs can never, ever get out. Suddenly, from deep down in the pitch-black belly of the basement, I heard a sound. It was faint, muffled by the depth of the house, but unmistakable in the silence between my hammer strikes. It was the sharp, metallic clink of a heavy chain dragging across a concrete floor, followed by a weak, raw, trembling whimper. It wasn't a dog. It was a woman. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought I was going to crack my sternum. The blood drained from my face and my hands started to shake violently. I was standing inside the house of a monster, miles away from another living soul, in the dead of night. If he realized that I knew what he was hiding, I would never leave that house. I would end up in the dark basement, adding my own scratch marks to the inside of that heavy oak door. "Is everything alright down there?" David's voice came from right over my shoulder. He had moved silently across the hardwood floor, and he was standing so close behind me, I could feel the heat radiating off his sweater. I could smell his cinnamon cologne, masking something sour underneath. The casual, polite tone was entirely gone from his voice. It was flat, monotone, and laced with quiet menace. Every muscle in my body seized up in sheer terror. I realized I had stopped chiseling and was just staring into the dark stairwell. I took a slow, agonizing breath, forcing my heart rate down by sheer willpower, and turned my head just enough to look at him out of the corner of my eye. I had to deliver the performance of my life. "Yeah," I lied, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "Yeah, everything's fine. The grain on this oak is just really dense. It's chewing up the edge of my chisel, making a bit of a bitch to get the strike plate flush." I turned back to the doorframe and struck the chisel with the hammer, deliberately focusing entirely on the tiny flake of wood I was removing. I didn't look at the scratch marks. I didn't look downstairs. I shut off every part of my brain that was screaming in terror and becoming nothing but a machine installing a lock. David didn't move. He stood inches behind me for what felt like an eternity, breathing softly through his nose. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, save for the rhythmic tap of my hammer. Finally, he took a half step back. "Well, take your time," he said, and his voice was back to that smooth, pleasant purr. "I want to make sure it's done right. We wouldn't want any accidents, would we?" I nodded dumbly, keeping my eyes glued to the metal plate. It took me another 20 agonizing minutes to finish assembling the lock mechanism. Every time I had to reach across the open doorway to secure a screw, I expected a hand to reach out from the dark and pull me down, or for David to just smash something over the back of my head. My shirt was completely soaked with cold sweat. When I finally clicked the lock cylinder into place and tested the key, the metallic thunk of the deadbolt sliding home sounded like a cell door slamming shut. I packed my tools into my bag meticulously, taking care not to rush, not to show that I was desperate to bolt. We walked back to the front door together. I wrote up the invoice on my clipboard, my hand trembling so badly I could barely form the numbers. David pulled a thick money clip from his pocket and counted out 5 crisp $100 bills, handing them to me with a generous tip and that same dead-eyed, terrifying smile. He thanked me again for my excellent service and wished me a safe drive home in the rain. I mumbled a professional goodbye, walked out the front door, and forced myself not to run to my van. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. David was standing in the large front window, perfectly illuminated by the interior lights, watching my taillights disappear down his long, dark driveway. I didn't call the police right away. I was terrified he might have a scanner, or that if I stopped near the property, he would come after me. I drove white-knuckled for almost 10 miles, breaking every speed limit, until I hit an all-night diner on the main highway. I pulled into the glaring neon lights of the parking lot, threw open the door, and vomited onto the wet asphalt. Then I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I told the dispatcher everything. The fake story, the gouges on the door, the smell, the sound of the chains, and the absolute certainty that someone was being held captive in that basement. I waited at the diner until 2 state trooper cruisers arrived, and I led them back to the private gravel road. I didn't go up to the house with them. I stayed parked at the bottom of the driveway, listening to the police radio crackle. The raid happened fast. Within 20 minutes, ambulances and a forensics team were called to the scene. I watched them bring David out in handcuffs. He wasn't wearing his cozy sweater anymore, and he wasn't smiling. The true crime part of the story, the part that ended up in the local papers a few days later, was that David wasn't his real name, and he didn't own the house. He was a drifter who had broken in while the real owners were wintering in Florida. He had been using the isolated property as a personal playground for weeks. They found 3 women in that basement. 2 of them were chained to support pillars in a makeshift soundproofed room at the back of the cellar. They were severely malnourished and traumatized, but they were alive. The 3rd woman, the one who had likely left those frantic scratch marks on the inside of the oak door while trying to escape months prior, was found buried in the soft dirt of the crawl space. I quit the locksmith business the very next day. I sold my tools and predictable job doing data entry in a brightly lit cubicle surrounded by dozens of people. Even now, years later, whenever the weather turns cold and the rain starts misting against the windows at night, I can still smell that foul chemical stench. I can still hear the metallic clink of a chain in the dark, and I can still see the dead, calculating eyes of a monster in a nice sweater, calmly watching me build the cage that was meant to hold his victims forever. I really hate dragging this memory up, and to be honest, I'm only doing it because my therapist thinks writing it out in full will somehow stop the night sweats. I doubt it. People always ask me to tell this story at parties when the topic turns to creepy things, expecting some fun, spooky campfire tale about a ghost in the machine or a haunted building. They want a neat little narrative with a jump scare. It exhausts me because there is nothing fun about what actually happened, and there was no ghost. It was just humanity functioning at its absolute rotting worst, and the reality of it is so mundane and gross that it completely ruins the party vibe anyway. I'm annoyed I even have to revisit it, but here it is. Just the facts of the worst night of my life, exactly as it happened, in the hopes that putting it on a page will finally get it out of my head. This was about 6 years ago. I was working for a third-party logistics company that got contracted to do massive overnight inventory counts for commercial warehouses. It was soul-crushing, mind-numbing work. You go into these colossal, windowless concrete boxes at 10 o'clock at night, and you spend the next 10 hours scanning barcodes on pallets of dog food or cheap plastic toys or industrial solvents. The turnover rate for the job was astronomical because the hours destroyed your social life and the environments were profoundly depressing. You are basically a ghost, haunting a monument to consumerism. Our assignment for a 3-week stretch in November was a defunct regional distribution center out in the middle of a massive industrial park near the state line. The company that owned it had gone bankrupt, and the bank was liquidating the assets. The building was easily 600,000 square feet. If you stood at one end of the main center aisle, the other end literally faded into a hazy, dusty vanishing point. It was so big it had its own indoor weather system. The air was always heavy, tasting metallic and stale, like diesel exhaust and damp cardboard. Because the building was in receivership, the bank was keeping the utilities at the bare minimum. The heat was off and only every third bank of overhead sodium vapor lights was turned on, casting these long, sickly orange shadows across the concrete. It was just 3 of us assigned to the shift that night. Me, a guy in his late 50s named Greg, who spent his entire shift listening to talk radio on a single earpiece, and Maya, a college student who was perpetually wired on gas station energy drinks and barely spoke. We were completely isolated. The nearest open business was a truck stop about 4 miles down the highway. The front office doors were chained shut, so we had to enter and exit through a massive rolling dock door at the back of the building. Once we were inside, the silence of the place was deafening. The only sounds were the distant, echoing squeaks of our rubber soles on the polished concrete and the occasional, unsettling groan of the building's metal roof settling in the cold night air. Around 3 in the morning, the fatigue was starting to make my eyes play tricks on me. We were assigned to Sector J, which was the deepest, oldest part of the warehouse. It hadn't seen active use in probably a decade. The racking systems here towered 40 feet into the air, loaded with forgotten, obsolete inventory that was covered in an inch of thick gray dust. The lighting in Sector J was completely blown out. The overhead fixtures were dead, meaning we had to navigate the narrow aisles using the heavy industrial flashlights the company provided. The beams of our flashlights cut through the floating dust motes like physical things, illuminating tower walls of cardboard boxes. We were working our way down an aisle that was designated for return merchandise, damaged goods that had never been processed. Greg was scanning the lower levels. Maya was using a rolling staircase to hit the middle tiers, and I was logging the master pallet tags on a clipboard. We were an hour into the sector, not saying a word to each other, just functioning like automatons. That's when the smell hit us. It didn't waft in gradually. It hit us like a physical wall. It was a dense, suffocating stench of rotting meat, human waste, and something sharply chemical, like bleach trying and failing to cover up the decay. Maya actually gagged and almost dropped her scanner. Greg pulled his earpiece out, his face turning a pale, sickly green in the flashlight beam. We didn't say anything at first. In a warehouse that size, you encounter dead animals occasionally. Raccoons or feral cats get in, get trapped, and die in the racks. You usually just report the location to the facility manager and move on. But this smell was overwhelmingly large. It was too much mass for a raccoon. We instinctively followed the odor, tracking it down the aisle to a cross-section where 4 towering racks met. The smell was pouring down from above us. I aimed my flashlight up into the steel scaffolding of the shelving. About 30 feet up, nestled on the very top tier right beneath the corrugated metal ceiling, something was blocking out the negative space. Instead of square pallets of boxes, the top level was a chaotic, tangled mass of black industrial shrink wrap, stolen blue tarps, and broken wooden pallets, woven together to form a massive, hanging nest. It looked like a grotesque tumor growing out of the steel racking. Someone had carefully unscrewed the metal safety grating from the lower shelves to create a makeshift jagged ladder leading all the way up to the suspended enclosure. Logic completely abandoned us in that moment. The smart thing, the only thing we should have done, was turn around, walk out the dock door, and call the police. But human curiosity is a deeply stupid, self-destructive flaw. Maya and Greg looked at me, their eyes wide and terrified in the dark, silently asking what to do. I don't know why I did it, but I set my clipboard down, grabbed my flashlight, and started climbing the makeshift ladder of broken pallets. Greg grabbed my ankle for a second, a silent plea to stop, but I shook him off. The metal was freezing cold, and the smell grew exponentially worse with every foot I climbed. By the time my head crested the top of the platform, my eyes were watering so badly from the ammonia and decay that everything was blurry. I hauled myself up onto the solid floor of the nest, keeping my body low to the dusty steel grate. I clicked my flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the dim, ambient orange light bleeding in from the distant aisles. The space was enormous, spanning across 3 adjacent pallet bays. It was a fully functional, horrifyingly surreal living space. There were battery-powered camping lanterns strung up on parachute cords, casting a pale, flickering light. The floor was insulated with layers of stolen blankets. There was a camping toilet in the corner, surrounded by empty bleach bottles. But it was the center of the room that made my brain completely short-circuit, refusing to process the reality of what I was seeing. There was a cheap, plastic folding table set up in the middle of the platform. Around the table sat 3 plastic lawn chairs. 2 of the chairs were occupied. Slouched in the seats were human figures entirely cocooned in thick, opaque black pallet wrap. The wrap was wound so tightly around them that it deformed their features, turning them into featureless, shiny black statues. Dark, thick fluids had leaked from the bottom of the plastic wrappings, pooling and drying into sticky black crusts on the moving blankets beneath the chairs. Sitting in the 3rd chair, facing away from me, was a man. He was wearing a filthy, oversized high-vis safety jacket, the kind construction workers wear. He was casually reading a battered paperback book by the light of a small headlamp he had strapped to his forehead. In his right hand, he was holding a half-eaten sleeve of saltine crackers, occasionally bringing one to his mouth and chewing slowly, making soft, wet smacking sounds. He was having a midnight snack with 2 decomposing corpses wrapped in shipping plastic, 40 feet in the air, in an abandoned warehouse. The terror I felt wasn't a spike of adrenaline. It was a slow, freezing paralysis that started in my chest and locked every muscle in my body. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't blink. I just stared at the back of his greasy, unwashed hair. Below me, I heard the faint, metallic scrape of Greg trying to follow me up the ladder. The sound was microscopic in the cavernous warehouse, but up on the platform, it sounded like a gunshot. The man stopped chewing. He didn't flinch or jump. He just slowly, methodically closed his paperback book, using a ripped piece of cardboard as a bookmark. He set the book down on the plastic table, right next to the dark, sticky pool leaking from one of his guests. Then, he turned his head and looked directly at me. He looked entirely average. He could have been a guy in line ahead of you at the grocery store, or a middle school math teacher. He had a patchy beard, thick glasses, and mild, tired eyes. There was no rage in his expression. There was no panic at being discovered. When he saw me, half crawling onto his floor, his face broke into a gentle, slightly apologetic smile. He looked at me, then looked at the 2 black plastic-wrapped bodies, and then back to me. He raised his index finger to his lips in a universal shushing gesture. Then, he pointed a finger at the bodies, tilted his head, and gave me a look of mild chastisement. The exact way a parent would look at a loud teenager who was about to wake up a sleeping baby. He was asking me to keep the noise down out of respect for the dead thing sitting at his table. The sheer, unfathomable madness of that gesture snapped me out of my paralysis. My mind couldn't handle this surreal situation. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the metal grating. I practically threw myself down that makeshift ladder, sliding down the last 10 feet and collapsing onto the concrete floor next to Greg and Maya. They saw my face in the dim light, and whatever they saw there made them instantly realize we were in a life or death situation. I grabbed them both by the jackets, pulling them close, and mouthed the word "run" with a violence that made my jaw ache. We moved in a frantic, speed-walking crouch, navigating the pitch-black aisles purely by memory, keeping our flashlights off. We kept one hand on the massive steel racks to guide us, trying to muffle the sound of our breathing. Greg was hyperventilating, emitting these tiny high-pitched wheezes that sounded like a squeaky toy. Maya was crying silently, tears tracking through the thick dust on her face, but she moved with a desperate animal efficiency. We made it out of Sector J and into the main artery of the warehouse, where the sparse orange lights finally provided some visibility. We were about 400 yards away from the back dock door. We thought we had a head start. We thought we had slipped away. Then the lights at the far end of the warehouse, directly above the sector we had just fled, shut off with a massive, echoing clack. A few seconds later, the next bank of lights shut off. He was at the main breaker panels, located on the support pillars at the end of each aisle. He was walking towards us, shutting down the sparse lighting as he went, methodically plunging the warehouse into absolute suffocating darkness. He wasn't rushing. We could hear his footsteps now. They were casual, even unhurried and rhythmic. He was dragging something heavy and metallic behind him on the concrete. The sound echoed off the corrugated ceiling, making it impossible to tell exactly which aisle he was walking down. The sound was everywhere. Then he started whistling. It wasn't a creepy nursery rhyme or a horror movie trope. It was a cheerful, upbeat pop song from the early 2000s. He was whistling it perfectly, hitting every note, casually strolling through the pitch-black labyrinth, hunting us in a building he clearly knew better than we ever could. Panic fully overtook us. We abandoned stealth and broke into a dead sprint. The darkness was absolute now. We crashed into pallets, tearing our clothes and bruising our legs on unseen corners. Greg tripped over a discarded shrink wrap core and went down hard, his knee smashing into the concrete with a sickening crunch. He let out a muffled scream, and the whistling in the dark abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was infinitely worse than the whistling. We knew he was listening. We knew he had pinpointed our location. Maya and I grabbed Greg by his armpits and hauled him up. He couldn't put weight on his leg, so we dragged him, half carrying his weight, our lungs burning with the stale metallic air. We blindly navigated by the faint sliver of moonlight bleeding in from the tiny windows at the very top of the loading dock doors in the distance. I don't remember the exact path we took. I just remember the physical agony of dragging Greg, the sound of my blood roaring in my ears, and the terrifying realization that the heavy dragging footsteps were getting closer, cutting us off on an intercept course. He was moving parallel to us, one aisle over. We burst out of the racking aisles and into the open staging area in front of the loading docks. The exit door was 50 feet away. It was a heavy industrial steel fire door with a panic bar. We dragged Greg to the door and I slammed my weight into the crash bar. It didn't budge. The bank had padlocked the fire exits from the outside to prevent squatters. I turned around, pressing my back against the cold steel door, staring out into the vast ink-black ocean of the warehouse. We were trapped. Maya was frantically shaking the padlock, sobbing audibly now. Greg had collapsed onto the floor, clutching his knee. We had no weapons. We had nowhere to hide in the open staging area. From the absolute darkness of the nearest aisle, a flashlight beam clicked on. It was blindingly bright. The beam swept across the floor, illuminating Greg, moved up to Maya, and finally settled squarely on my face. I threw my arm up to block the glare. "You guys really shouldn't be making so much noise," a voice called out from behind the light. It was a calm, reasonable, slightly disappointed voice. "People are trying to sleep." The beam of light started moving forward. He stepped out of the aisle. I couldn't see his face behind the glare of the flashlight, but I could hear the scraping of whatever he was dragging. Desperation makes you look for things you normally wouldn't see. Next to the chained fire door was a massive rolling bay door meant for semi-trucks. It was lowered and locked, but right beside the tracks was a small, red, glass-covered box. The emergency manual override for the dock door hydraulics. I didn't think, I just lunged. I smashed my elbow into the glass, shattering it, and yanked the heavy red lever down with everything I had. Sirens immediately erupted in the building. A deafening, pulsing mechanical shriek designed to alert everyone on the floor that a massive door was moving. The electric motor groaned, and the massive corrugated metal door began to slowly, agonizingly grind upward. The sudden chaotic noise and the rush of freezing air outside seemed to break the man's surreal spell. The flashlight beam jerked violently. He didn't charge us. Instead, he stopped, the beam of light dancing wildly across the floor, as if the blaring alarm was physically painful to him. The door was only about 2 feet, but it was enough. Maya shoved Greg under the gap, practically rolling him out onto the exterior concrete loading pad. She scrambled under next. I looked back one last time. The flashlight beam was retreating, moving quietly back into the depths of the warehouse, swallowed by the massive racks. I dropped to my stomach and shimmied under the heavy metal door, scraping my back on the rivets, and rolled out into the freezing November rain. We didn't stop. We dragged Greg down the concrete ramp, across the massive empty parking lot, and into the tree line near the highway, hiding in the wet brush until a passing state trooper saw us waving frantically from the ditch. The police raid on the warehouse lasted for 3 days. The scale of what they found made national news, though I refuse to watch the documentaries they make about it now. The man wasn't just a squatter. He was a transient who had been using the defunct logistics network of an abandoned warehouse across the Midwest to move and hide bodies. They found the 2 wrapped figures at his little dinner table. They found 4 more, hidden inside hollowed-out pallets of dog food in Sector G. They found a collection of driver's licenses neatly filed into a Rolodex on his makeshift bedside table. They never caught him. By the time the SWAT team breached the building, he had vanished, slipping out through the ventilation shaft on the roof that he had meticulously unbolted. He just faded back into the sprawling, invisible infrastructure of abandoned industrial America. I quit the logistics job, obviously. I work from home now. I don't go into large buildings. I don't shop at big box stores. And I absolutely refuse to engage with people who think that true crime is a fun, casual interest. There is nothing entertaining about knowing that monsters don't hide in the shadows. They just put on a high-vis vest, pull up a chair, and wait for you to stumble into their living room. I used to listen to a lot of scary stories online while I worked, which is deeply ironic considering the job I had at the time. Back in the fall of 2017, I was a broke college student trying to pay my rent, and I managed to get a job as an independent contractor doing property preservation photography. It sounds fancy, but it basically just meant I was the guy the banks hired to go out to foreclosed, abandoned, or heavily delinquent properties to take pictures. The bank needed proof of the property's condition before they could auction it off. You got paid a flat rate per house, which meant the only way to make decent money was to take on the properties that the other photographers refused to visit. These were usually the houses located way out in the rural, unincorporated parts of the country, hidden deep down unpaved logging roads where the GPS on your phone would just stop working. Most of the time, the job was just gross and sad. You'd walk through houses filled with black mold, rotting garbage, and the leftover belongings of families who had to leave in the middle of the night. But you were always alone. At least, you were supposed to be alone. It was mid-November, and the days were painfully short. The sun was already starting to dip below the tree line by the time I pulled out into a deeply rutted dirt road for my last property of the day. It was a rush order from the bank, paying triple the normal rate because the auction was scheduled for the very next morning. The drive took me nearly 40 miles outside the nearest town, deep into a heavily wooded area where the cell service had completely dropped off 20 minutes prior. The road was so narrow that the bare branches of the trees were violently scraping against the sides of my cheap sedan. By the time I finally saw the property, the sky was a bruised dark purple and the woods were completely silent. The house was a dilapidated 2-story farmhouse that looked like it had been rotting away for decades. The roof was sagging, the yard was a jungle of dead weeds, and the windows were all boarded up from the inside with thick plywood. It looked like a textbook haunted house, but I had a job to do. I parked my car facing the dirt road, grabbed my heavy DSLR camera and a heavy-duty tactical flashlight, and walked up the crumbling front porch. The bank had given me the code for the real estate lockbox hanging on the front doorknob. I punched in the 4 digits, retrieved the physical key, and unlocked the deadbolt. The door swelled in its frame, requiring me to put my shoulder into it to force it open. The smell that hit me instantly was suffocating, but it wasn't the usual smell of an abandoned house. Usually, you smell mildew, animal urine, and stale dust. This house smelled overwhelmingly of industrial bleach, mixed with a sticky, sweet, metallic odor that I couldn't quite identify. The air inside was freezing, somehow colder than the late autumn air outside. Because the windows were boarded up, the interior was pitch black. I turned on my flashlight and began my standard routine. The bank required a specific sequence of photos: the entryway, the living room, the kitchen, the bathrooms, and every bedroom. I moved methodically through the first floor, my camera flash lighting up the darkness in blinding, split-second bursts. As I moved into the kitchen, my flashlight beam swept across the floor and I froze. The house was completely gutted of furniture, and the floors were covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. But right in the middle of the kitchen linoleum, leading toward a heavy wooden door at the back of the room, was a set of fresh, muddy boot prints. They were large, deep, and clearly very recent. My heart started to beat a little faster. Property preservation photographers are constantly warned about squatters, and you are strictly told never to confront anyone and to just leave the premises immediately. I told myself it was probably just a transient trying to stay out of the cold, and I decided I would just snap a picture of the back door to prove I couldn't access the rest of the house, and then leave. But as I walked closer to that heavy wooden door, the smell of bleach and that sweet, rotting copper scent became so overpowering it made my eyes water. I shined my light on the door. It wasn't just a standard interior door. It had been reinforced with heavy steel plates, and there was a massive, commercial-grade sliding deadbolt installed on the inside, securing it shut. Someone had locked this door from the kitchen side, meaning whatever, or whoever was behind it, was trapped. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to run out the front door, get in my car, and drive until I had cell service. But that morbid human curiosity, the kind that gets people killed in horror movies, took over. I reached out, my hand shaking violently, and slid the heavy metal bolt back. It was well oiled and slid with zero resistance. I gripped the doorknob, turned it, and pulled the door open. Beyond the door was a steep, narrow set of wooden stairs leading down into a basement. The smell coming up from the dark was so horrific, I actually had to pull my shirt up over my nose to stop myself from gagging. I aimed my flashlight down the stairwell. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated the basement floor. I felt my stomach drop into my shoes and the blood instantly drained from my face. The entire basement, the concrete floor, the brick walls, and even the exposed wooden ceiling joists, was entirely covered in thick, translucent plastic sheeting. It was held up by miles of silver duct tape. In the dead center of the room, sitting on the plastic-covered floor, was a single, rusted metal folding chair. There were dark, heavy reddish-brown stains pooling around the legs of the chair, smudged across the plastic tarp. I didn't need a background in forensics to know exactly what I was looking at. This wasn't a squatter's den. I had just walked into a literal kill room. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling so badly I could barely breathe. I had to get out immediately. I turned around to sprint for the front door, but before I could take a single step, the entire house vibrated. Outside, on the gravel driveway I had just pulled into, I heard the unmistakable crunch of heavy off-road truck tires coming to a stop. The engine cut off, and then I heard the heavy metallic thud of two car doors slamming shut. They were parked right behind my sedan. I was blocked in. Panic completely rewired my brain in a fraction of a second. I heard heavy boots stomping up the rotting wooden steps of the front porch. I had no weapon, no cell service, and there was no back door. The only exit was the front door, and they were currently unlocking it. I couldn't hide upstairs because the wooden floorboards creaked so loudly they would hear my every move. In a moment of sheer, blind terror, I did the only thing I could think of. I ripped the basement door open, quietly slipped inside, closed the door tight behind me, and crept silently down the wooden stairs into the plastic-lined nightmare room. I reached the bottom of the stairs and frantically shined my light around for a hiding spot. The basement was essentially empty, save for the chair, but in the far back corner, partially concealed behind the massive, rusted husk of an old oil furnace, the plastic sheeting was torn, leaving a gap just big enough for a person. I squeezed myself behind the freezing metal tank, curling my body into a tight ball, and shut off my flashlight. Absolute suffocating darkness swallowed me. A second later, I heard the front door upstairs open, followed by the deep, muffled voices of at least two men. They were speaking casually, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards directly above my head. Dust drifted down from the ceiling joists, landing in my hair. I pressed my hands clamped hard over my own mouth, terrified that the sound of my ragged breathing would somehow echo up through the floor. The footsteps moved from the living room into the kitchen. The voices grew louder. One of them said something about a mess, and the other laughed, a dry, guttural sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then the basement door opened. A shaft of pale yellow light spilled down the wooden stairs, illuminating the plastic sheeting on the floor in front of the furnace. Heavy boots began to descend the stairs. It wasn't just one person, it was definitely two, and from the sounds of their strained grunting, they were carrying something incredibly heavy between them. They reached the bottom of the stairs, their boots squeaking against the plastic floor. They were standing no more than 15 feet away from my hiding spot. I was squeezed so tightly behind the furnace that the rusted metal was cutting into my back. With a heavy, sickening thud, they dropped whatever they were carrying onto the concrete floor. The impact shook the ground. I couldn't see them, but I could hear everything with terrifying clarity. I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy industrial zipper being pulled open, followed by a wet, shifting noise that makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. The men started talking again, their voices completely devoid of any emotion. They were discussing the depth of a hole, the frozen ground, and making sure they had enough lye in the truck. They were treating this like a mundane landscaping project, completely detached from the reality of the human body they had just dumped onto the plastic tarp. My lungs were burning. I hadn't taken a full breath in what felt like hours. My leg was starting to severely cramp from being curled into such an unnatural position. I tried to slightly shift my weight to relieve the pressure on my knee. As I moved, the strap of my heavy camera, which was still hanging around my neck, swung forward. The thick plastic lens hood gently tapped against the hollow metal side of the oil furnace. It was a tiny metallic clink, but in the dead silence of the basement, it sounded like a firecracker. The men instantly stopped talking. The silence that followed was the most agonizing, terrifying void I have ever experienced. I knew they were listening. I knew they were looking into the dark. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for a miracle, preparing for the flashlight beam to hit my face. Slowly and deliberately, one set of footsteps began to walk toward the furnace. The plastic squeaked beneath his boots with every step. He was taking his time. He knew he had cornered a rat, and there was no rush. He stopped right on the other side of the rusted metal tank. I could hear his breathing. I could smell the stale cigarette smoke on his clothes mixed with the horrific stench of the room. Suddenly, upstairs, a jarring electronic ringing shattered the silence. It was a cheap, generic cell phone ringtone, echoing loudly through the empty kitchen above. The man standing on the other side of the furnace swore under his breath. The other man grunted and started walking rapidly up the stairs. I heard him answer the phone, his voice suddenly frantic and angry. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pure panic. A second later, he yelled down the stairs to the other man, telling them they had to leave right that second, that something had gone wrong at another location. The man next to the furnace hesitated for an agonizing second, then turned and ran up the stairs. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, and I heard the horrific metallic scrape of the heavy deadbolt sliding into place on the outside. I was locked in. A moment later, the front door slammed. The truck engine roared to life, and the tires spun aggressively on the gravel before tearing off down the dirt road, fading into the distance. I was alone in the pitch-black basement with a body. I didn't move for at least 10 minutes, paralyzed by the fear that it was a trick, that they were waiting for me to make a sound. Finally, when the silence became absolute, I turned my flashlight back on. I kept the beam pointed strictly at the stairs, refusing to look at the center of the room. I crept out from behind the furnace and ran up the steps. I shoved my shoulder against the wooden door with everything I had, but the heavy deadbolt on the other side didn't give a single millimeter. The door was solid core, and I had no tools to break it down. I ran back down the stairs, sweeping my flashlight around the walls. Near the ceiling on the far wall, there was a small rectangular basement window. It was boarded up from the outside with plywood, but the wooden frame looked rotten. I found a heavy, rusted metal pipe lying near the water heater. I climbed up onto a stack of old cinder blocks, raised the pipe, and started smashing it into the plywood window covering. I swung with the manic, adrenaline-fueled strength of someone fighting for their life. The wood splintered and cracked, and after a dozen blows, the plywood shattered outward, letting in the freezing night air. The window was incredibly small, framed with sharp shards of broken glass, but I didn't care. I shoved my head and shoulders through the opening, dragging my body over the jagged glass. It sliced through my jacket and tore deeply into my stomach and chest, but the pain didn't even register. I fell out onto the dead grass of the backyard, scrambled to my feet, and didn't even look back. I knew my car was out front, but I didn't care. I ran directly into the dense, pitch-black woods, plunging through thorns and thick brush, running blindly through the dark until my lungs felt like they were bleeding. I ran for over 3 hours, navigating purely by the moon, until I finally stumbled out onto a paved country highway. A passing long-haul truck driver saw me covered in blood and dirt, stumbling along the shoulder, and called 911. When the state police finally arrived, I sat in the back of the cruiser, wrapped in a shock blanket, and told them everything about the house, the plastic room, and the men. The police raided the property at dawn. The news reports a few days later were heavily censored, but the details that leaked out were horrifying. The property wasn't just a random foreclosure. It was being used as a central disposal site for a highly organized, violent drug cartel operating across state lines. The police found the body I had been locked in with, along with evidence of dozens of other victims buried deep in the woods surrounding the property. The men who had trapped me in that basement were never caught, having completely vanished into the wind after that phone call spooked them. I never went back to property photography, and I dropped out of college later that semester because I couldn't handle sitting in crowded lecture halls anymore. To this day, years later, I cannot sleep without the lights on. Every time I hear the crunch of tires on gravel or catch the faint scent of bleach in a public restroom, my heart stops, and I am right back in that pitch-black corner holding my breath, listening to the heavy boots squeaking on the plastic floor, waiting for the flashlight to find me.